In the racial contract, you detail how acts of rebellion and revolt by non-white groups are met with escalated levels of white violence by the state. In fact, you say that the white state uses massively disproportionate retaliatory violence against non-white groups to extinguish any acts of resistance. I wanted to get your ideas on the role of race, privilege, and the leeway that white people may have in committing acts of rebellion against the white state.
Yes, now bear in mind, of course, that in the book, I'm generalizing over several hundred years and talking about many different countries. I'm talking about the colonial system, I'm talking about the slave system and so forth. So, violence is, certainly one aspect historically, but there's also ideology. And in terms of where the US is now, I would say that the role of ideology is more important in maintaining the system. I mean, I don't want to say to rule out violence, given what we just mentioned earlier about the huge, disproportionately, people of color prison system, but the role of ideology, really becomes more crucial. So that whereas, for example, if you think of the history of the white riot, people, you hear the phrase race riots, they think of blacks rioting, but well into the 20th century, race riots were really white riots. So, for example, riots in the 1890s to take back power from, sort of black sort of civic regimes that, blacks were in power, or 1919 after World War I, the so-called Red Summer, when you had, white riots all across the country. But we're not so much in that period now. And state violence, though you certainly had it, if you think, for example, of the suppression of, radical movements in the 60s and so forth, I'd want to sort of talk more about the role of ideology now. And, the question of, what racial remains to be done. And this is why a sort of crucial question becomes, how do you sort of convey to the white majority that blacks are still systemically disadvantaged, despite, the history of civil rights legislation, despite 2 terms of a black president, despite, black members of Congress and so forth. So certainly, violence is there, but I think the very fact that, we had members of the military coming out publicly and distancing themselves, from the threat to sort of, bring the military in to suppress, the demonstrations, I think this is an indication. I would like to hope, fingers crossed, that, it's not going to be a recourse sort of those old-fashioned, I hope not anyway. So I would like to think that it's going to be more a question of the ideological battle, how things are framed.
Okay. So it sounds like you're cautiously optimistic that
Cautiously optimistic, yes.
A little bit away from that long history of excessive retaliatory violence, white violence against quote unquote black rebellion? Or do you feel like it's more a function of the fact that this current rebellion or movement of demonstrations that we're having now is very white in terms of the representation of the people that are actually there in the crowd?
That's an excellent point, because certainly historically, though there's been a willingness to use violence against the white working class. If we think of the sort of history of strikes, 19th century up to early 20th century, and also white radicals. So you have to sort of qualify the judgment, but overall there's a sort of greater willingness sort of target populations of color, since they're the ones sort of more formally subordinated by the system. But yes, I think one of the very hopeful signs is the multiracial composition of the crowd. So there's a number of factors. There's the fact that the demonstrations have gone on for such a long time, that they've been so geographically dispersed, thousands of places across the country, and the sort of highly multiracial composition of the crowds. So these are signs of hope, and also the fact that you have prominent mainstream figures coming out and expressing solidarity. When Mitt Romney says Black Lives Matter, well, all right, so who knows where that could lead. But there's also, you can't be naive, you can't ignore the history. And it's easy to get caught up in the moment until you sort of think back to all the other moments there have been. So after the Civil War, there was a moment which was lasted for more than just a moment of Reconstruction. It was easy to think, now at last, we'll have a racially just society. If you think of the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, many people in the Black community thought, well, at last, this is it. It's a condemnation of segregation. So from here on, it'll be great. 1963 March on Washington. If you think of the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, in the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, and so forth. But the problem is that you have the moments, and then the moments pass, and how much changes. And various people have drawn the comparison between Richard Nixon in 1968 and the sort of formal campaign strategy of he's a law and order president. There's been a lot of debate in columns and the Times and various other places. Can our president sort of follow that route? And people are saying no, he can't, because Nixon was basically challenging the Democratic Party, whereas President Trump is the incumbent. The economic situation is not the same, and you have a much larger component of the white population supportive of what the demonstrators are asking for. But a comparison I've not seen that many people draw is Lyndon Johnson's appointment of people to look into the rights of the 60s. So this was called the Kerner Commission on the Civil Rights Disorders. And so this is a Democratic president, but this is a good old Southern boy for whom the N-word was never far from his lips. So he's appointing people to look into the civil disorders of the 1960s. And the report they issue basically says the problem is white racism. So it was one of the most sort of startling indictments of the US, because it's not Black radicals saying this, it's respectable white guys in a commission appointed by President Lyndon Johnson. And it sold millions of copies when it came out, and there's versions still available. You can buy a reprinted version. But the crucial point I want to make is that they made all these recommendations about what needed to be done to address this systemic racism. And a half century later, in 2018, it was virtually the case that not much had really been done along those lines. And the one surviving member of the Kerner Commission had a co-authored New York Times op-ed in which he was basically deploring the fact that so little had been done. So apart from the question of whether or not a law and order strategy will basically win a second term for the president, there's a question of, even if out of all these demonstrations, let's say the Democrats get in, let's say there are various commissions, the various inquiries, and you have a set of recommendations, there's a crucial question of, will they actually be implemented? Once the moment has died down, people get tired of demonstration, people go home and so on. And that's where I say, the history of the country is not an encouraging one. And what I would want to suggest is that what needs to be done, this raises in a sense broader questions perhaps than you wanted to get into, but what needs to be done, and remember how crucial the economic situation is, because the US will be moving in a period of great economic hardship for many people who will not be able to find money to pay their rent, who will be sort of needing to find a job to keep food on the table, to keep a roof over their heads, to send their children to school. So to expect that a large section of the white population are going to continue to support this movement, I think in a sense it's unrealistic, because unfortunately I don't think social justice, racial justice can be a major motivator for a majority of people over a prolonged period. And what you really need to look to is group interests. And Derek Bell, late legal theorist, is famous for his interest convergence theorist, racial realism, where he says that major progress in the US on race is basically achieved when there's a convergence of white and Black interests. So I think that the Black Lives Matter program, police reform, all these issues being sort of put out need to be incorporated into a larger social justice program that can mobilize white group interests. So we have a movement of social reform to bring into existence a more socially equitable United States. And that we also have to look at the role of race historically in dividing, the disadvantage, in dividing the working class, which accounts, many people think that's a major explanation for the fact that the US has among the most inequitable income and wealth distributions of all the Western democracies. It has one of the weakest trade union movements, and it has no national social democratic party, as you have in Canada, as you have in Western Europe. So the thing to do, it seems to me, is to incorporate racial justice as a demand into a larger social justice movement, and in that way you can get a convergence of the interests of people of color and whites to bring about a more equitable nation that is working for everybody rather than just the small percentage of those at the top.
Okay, that's definitely a lot to think about, but that last thing you said, I feel, it resonates with me because this idea of group interests, right? Because I agree with your idea that it's going to be difficult to maintain this level of interest and commitment and participation on a large scale for most white people. Right now, the coronavirus is going on, and people are
absolutely,
they're stressed and they got a lot of free time on their hands, right? But it's also this idea that in order for white people to really stay involved, I think they're going to have to start to see that racism it benefits white people, but it's also bad for white people.
Yes, exactly.
Because
there's short-term interest and long-term interest. Right. And you can make a case that insofar as I say, the trade union movement, sort of high point in the 50s, about 30% of, the working population, I can't remember it's the working population, total population unionized, now down to like 10% or less. That basically has, is part of the reason why, income and wealth distributions are so inequitable, why the ratio of corporate CEOs to what workers are taking home is so great. There are a number of reasons why American capitalism is so different, so inequitable. I mean, obviously capitalism as such has a sort of dynamic. It's going to generate wealth at one scale and sort of not generate at the other. But the sort of degree of inequality, the fact that even conservative, even mainstream commentators, past years have started to use the term plutocracy. So we have plutocratic capitalism and race, I think, and many people, if you go back to W.B. Du Bois, various people in the Black radical community have argued that race is part of the explanation for that. So that you can say that race has worked for many white people in the short and even relatively long term, but that we're now in a period when maybe it's not going to be able to work as well, insofar as we're in a period of US manufacturing decline, the sort of exit of blue-collar jobs to, Brazil, Mexico, the Pacific Rim, and so forth, and that this is a time period when you're going to need solidarity across racial lines, and that means, as I say, you embed the racial justice project in a larger social democratic project.
Okay, very good, very good.